Welcome back, everyone, to week 14. This week, we are actually continuing on in India. We're going to look at a very difficult period in the next couple of weeks, and that is the period of colonization. And usually, in both my class of Asian art history and my class of the ancient Americas, both of those classes generally tend to end with colonization. And then the British came. The end. But I hate to leave it there because there is so much more artistic development that happens after these regions regain their independence. And it's such a rich cultural uh, mix of cultures that really represent contemporary art across Asia. So I'm going to talk a bit about colonization in Asia, about the colonization by the British of India, the architecture that develops from this mixture of cultures. And ultimately, we're going to briefly mention what it means to be an Indian artist today. And we're going to, you're going to watch a video a little bit on how contemporary Indian artists and scientists kind of grapple with their history. So I think that's a really interesting way to end our journey through India. And of course, this is a period of great historical changes, which we're not going to go delve deeply in the Indian independence movement, the separation of India from Pakistan. All of these are really important historical events to kind of keep in the back of your mind, but we're mostly going to be focusing in on the art today. So I brought in this map. This shows you the colonial empires at around 1900, and you can see here that India is part of the British Empire at this point. Now, next week, I think it's next week, we're going to be talking about China, and China never becomes a colony. However, it does fall under the influence, the very strong influence of the British Empire at this time as well. And then we're going to see how Japan manages to almost switch the tide there, and instead of becoming colonized, they become the colonizers themselves. All right. So, what is colonization, and what are the sort of the ideas that are propagated by colonialists in order to kind of propel this way of life and the oppression of vast populations? Because when we think about and we study this period, it's at least for me, it's almost impossible to wrap my head around how people could treat each other in this fashion. Well, the most important thing that happens, and we know this from our own history of slavery, is you make other people that are not like you suddenly inferior, right? They are not like you. So you start by creating differences between them and us, and we're going to see that in the architecture at the beginning. But then there's also a paternalistic instinct in the colonizer. And this is again to justify the oppression of others. This idea that I know better than you. So here come the civilized, quote unquote, Europeans, and they are going to bring civilization to the people of India, which makes absolutely no sense if you have been paying attention in class. It's been such a rich culture and such great achievements, and then here come these other people and they say my way is better than yours, and I'm going to show you my way, and I'm going to raise you up to my level of civilization and what I deem civilization. For them, it was a win-win situation, right? The colonizer gets the native resources because that is the main impulse behind colonization, to get the natural resources of the land, and also to get cheap or sometimes slave labor depending on the colonizer and the region. And then win-win. This colonized also gets to be civilized, which is a very kind of enlightenment idea that everybody should be civilized and enlightened, even if, you have to destroy native cultures in order to do this. And I brought in this because this is from an early illustration that kind of shows you how the colonizers saw themselves within India. And if you're starting to get angry here, it's okay to get angry. I get angry as well. And I'm showing you this. There is often the phrase, the burden on the white man's burden when it comes to colonization. And of course, this is an incredibly offensive, deeply troubling image. But this is the type of artwork that was being used as propaganda to, again, appease people, because you hear about all of the horrors that colonization created for native communities, not just in India and Africa and in the Americas, Southeast Asia. However, whenever these reports would get out, and people would start thinking, wait, what's going on over there? It seems like bad things are happening. Then comes the propaganda machine, and images like this, where you can see civilization sitting on her throne up here, and then we have, of course, the British here, and the Americans. Americans were another empire, as it were, that participated in colonization. And so you have the different, again, stereotyped and kind of viciously portrayed groups of people, all of the people that England is carrying on their back towards civilization, all of the groups that the United States is kind of carrying the burden for, and walking towards civilization and getting rid of barbarism and oppression and superstition and vice. So, all of these things that were negatively associated with native populations. Now, colonialism in India itself. So I did mention the British. The British are going to be the main colonizers of India. However, there are different groups. During this time, all of Europe was fighting over control of these areas, and India was the jackpot, because in India you had such a rich culture, natural resources, and of course, spices and tea. So you have the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, and the French. And of course, the British are the ones that are going to have the longest impact. In case you're wondering, as we watch these documentaries, how some people are speaking English, it is because in India, of course, English is still one of the languages that is taught in school. Now, with new rules comes new institutions. So the British don't only bring themselves, they colonize the area, and that means through infrastructure as well. So they see this, of course, as bringing civilization to India. Did they bring some structural and kind of health benefits? Yes, but at what cost as well? So we are going to see railway stations, right? So railway stations and transportation, courts, and of course, there had already been a legal system in place in India. It was very different than that of the British. However, this was a new civilized court. Colleges, so a modern education for society. Again, people had already been learning before. This is just a Western style of college. Hospitals, Western medicine. Now, there is a huge debate between Eastern medicine and Western medicine, which works best. Here we have Western medicine being brought in and imposed on people that were used to their traditional Eastern medicine. And things like bureaucracy and post office and things like this. Now, of course, when you think of all of these new institutions that are brought, you also have to ask yourself, who has access to these? Because for the most part, it's going to be British and Indian people that are of British parentage that are going to have access to these resources. And then we're going to look in particular at Indo-Saracenic architecture. And I know that's kind of a mouthful, but I'll show you, and then you'll have a perfect idea in your mind of what this is. So it is an architectural style of the late 19th century. So it drew on elements of Indo-Islamic architecture, which we just looked at last week, and of traditional South Asian architecture. Now, it also is going to, strangely enough, this is going to sound very strange, it's going to combine it with what's happening in Europe at the time, which is the Gothic revival and the neoclassic style. So this is Victorian Britain. And these are two of the very strong styles that are happening in Europe at the time. And they're going to integrate it into these traditional Indian architectural styles. And what you get are these, I mean, they're fascinating to look at, but there's just so much going on in these structures. And they lack the elegance and the harmony of the Mughal structures. And they almost become these kind of bastardized versions of Indian architecture. So the development of the style, you have to keep in mind this particular year, which is 1857. So before 1857, European classical style was employed for public buildings to distance themselves from the natives. So again, what I talked about at the beginning. So you have to ingrain in people that you are different than them. Those people are different. And so they did this through architecture. And then after the revolt of 1857, India began to be ruled by the British crown. So before this, it had been the domain of the British East India Company. And so now it's under the crown of the British Empire. And so, in order to legitimize their rule, because they've already had a revolt, and I mean, the population of India is huge, and you have just a few probably a few thousand people that are controlling the entire population. And so what you have is the attempt to legitimize the rule and to connect to the natives of this colonized land by kind of mixing up the architecture. And in this way, the British are trying to write themselves into Indian history. So it seems a logical conclusion that you would go from the Rajas into the Mughals and then into the British crown. So just because we have not touched on European architecture at all in this class, this is what neoclassical architecture would have looked like. So it looks very Greco-Roman, and it's all about the Enlightenment and the ideals of balance and proportion. And if you look at it just objectively, it is very much about pared down decoration, about balance and harmony, and things being very logical and almost plain in their design. And again, this is all going back to the ruins that they would see of their own cultural tradition of the Greeks and the Romans. And this is a quote I'm going to read for you from Roger T. Smith, who gave a talk at the Society for the Arts. And it says, "As our administration exhibits European justice, order, law, energy, and honor, and that in no hesitating or feeble way, so our buildings ought to hold up a high standard of European art. They ought to be European both as rallying points for ourselves and as raising a distinctive symbol of our presence to be beheld with respect and even with admirations by the natives of the country." So that is quite a quote, and I think it summarizes what I just explained. They saw this architecture bringing in the neoclassical and the neo-Gothic architecture as kind of emphasizing so that the people in India would not forget that they were European, right? And their own cultural tradition, but also almost to amaze the local population with the beauty of their art and the grandeur of their architecture, which to me is a little strange because Mughal architecture and native Indian architecture is just as beautiful as anything that the Europeans could have come up with. So some of the early structures kind of look like this. So they're using the materials that are found in India for the most part. So you have that red brick and stone. But it's very neoclassical. It's very balanced. There's not a huge amount of decoration. You have that pediment down over here with the columns. And then you get Indo-Saracenic architecture. So this is a mixture of Islamic architecture, traditional Hindu architecture, and you have to kind of mix those in and make them palatable to a British taste, right? We're talking 19th century British tastes in terms of what architecture should look like. And so some of the principal characteristics are onion domes, vaulted roofs, domed kiosks, many miniature domes. Let's just say many, many, many domes. Towers or minarets, open pavilions, and pierced open arcading. And so here is an example of what I was talking about. It's like you took the Taj Mahal and then you just kind of kept adding to it and you kept adding to it and then you went a little too far. And so we see it's not neoclassical like we saw in Europe, and it doesn't have. Strangely enough, both the neoclassical and the traditional Mughal architecture both have this kind of harmony, kind of soft, quiet harmony to the buildings, and this is neither of those. So here we have an example. This is the Muir College, and you can see how they're using some of the same materials that have been used in Indian history, the red sandstone. And you have these domes which come from the Mughals. But then there's some things that are just very European. And let me see if I can show you a better example. So this is the Madras University Senate House. And here you can see on this capital, it has some kind of turrets that are European, and then you have these very kind of almost medieval capitals, which are the very top of columns, right? These very Greco Roman columns. But then you have them decorated with Hindu iconography. So they are a very strange mix of styles. This is in Baroda, and it was from 1878 to 1890. And you can see how these buildings they started getting larger and larger. And of course, you have new technologies in the 19th century. You have the Industrial Revolution. A lot of these are steel construction. And during this period, there's also just throughout Europe a fascination with looking at everything historical. So this is why the neoclassic or the neo-Gothic, which is a medieval style. And so we see almost the same thing going on in India, in which they're kind of looking around themselves and saying, oh, that is historical, and that would, kind of connect us to this Indian narrative. Let's put it. And so they just kind of take pieces and parts of different architectural styles and put them together. And sometimes they are actually quite impressive, and sometimes they are just very strange to look at. So this one that's a little bit more pared down and it has this bright, vibrant color. To me, it's just a little bit more beautiful and in conversation with the like good mix of the different styles. We call this kind of a hybrid style because it blends in different cultural techniques and different iconography. Now, these type of hybrid styles happen all the time, and it's not a negative thing in and of itself. It's the narrative behind them that just is kind of disgusting. The idea that you can write yourself into somebody else's history and to use their own architectural styles, appropriate them in order to legitimize your rule over them. This is another example. So this is an art gallery. And in Bombay, this is a train station. And in this one, you can see some of that kind of Gothic medieval influence. So you have the rose windows here, you have the turrets, and so it has this feeling of almost of a cathedral, but then you have these weird domes and shapes involved as well. And you can see inside, it looks like a cathedral. This is the Prince of Wales Museum. So you see the use of that Mughal dome and some of these pointed arches. But it's the structure of the building itself is neoclassical, and you can see some of these neoclassical columns on the sides. Now, architecture aside, there's going to be a change in painting as well. So we are going to see the introduction of things like oil paints and canvases. And so as we looked at miniature painting in the last, I think it was last week, we can obviously tell that these artists were highly accomplished. But what we have is a European palette. So now the British are going to have control. It's no longer going to be the emperors and the court there. So you're going to have a different taste. So artists are going to have to adapt to the situation, and they learn to paint in the European style. The last thing I'm going to talk about in terms of how we go from colonization to an independent India and by extension Pakistan, because we see the separation of those two nation states. It's going to come down to not one particular moment, although there is a moment where, the independence is declared and official, uh, but it's going to be culturally about bringing back your history and your culture. And we see this through the art. So artists start challenging Western cultural dominance by reclaiming indigenous artistic traditions. So they crack the books open, they go to these historic sites, they look at the artwork of their ancestors, and they say, this is how we can gain independence from European control. It doesn't mean that we're just going to push aside completely all of the techniques and the technology and all of those things that we learned from the Europeans, but we can use those new techniques and innovative ways of looking at the world and apply them to our own historical tradition. And this is what we're going to see with contemporary Indian art. So contemporary Indian art, there's so many people in India, there's so many artists in India, and they're all creating all sorts of different types of art, as you saw in your book. I encourage all of you to look and check out the contemporary Indian art scene. And one thing that is unique about our contemporary time is there are a lot of artists that decide not to check in kind of with their cultural and historical background. They're part of this more kind of global art scene that does not tie itself to any particular culture. But there are many artists that are looking back at their culture, their own art history, and mixing it with global developments and with artistic influences from other regions. And this is why I say mixing cultures and techniques and that sort of thing is innovative, and it brings a lot of cultural innovation when it's done correctly. And here I am going to leave you with this image, and this is from a graphic novel. So there's actually been a huge boom in Indian graphic novels that tell some of the stories of the Hindu tradition, and they are beautiful to look at. And I'm going to have you check that out in a video. It's just a short clip, but I also encourage you to check some of these out. They're available on Amazon and places like that. So I'm going to leave you with this image. I'll come back and mention India before we finish our course